Good afternoon. We are finishing up Psalm 65 today. And if you remember from last time, Psalm 65 is a psalm of praise. It's a hymn of praise. So it follows pretty straightforward structures, being a psalm of praise. I want to read those back to you one time real quick. Just to give you a sense of the structure that we're looking at. So you're going to find my... Here we go. Sorry, having a little difficulty finding my summary here of the psalm I wanted to talk to you about real quick. Give me 1 second, I'll have it open. Okay, so a hymn or song of praise, 65. The structure is an introduction, a call to praise, sing, and rejoice to Yahweh in some form. Body is just the reasons. Why do we praise him? His quality, his attributes, his regular repeated actions. And then finally, a conclusion is to a renewed summons to praise. So we start off with a summons to praise, and we conclude with a summons to praise. And a summons to praise, we can look at it right here. Let's see here. I guess we would have the summons to praise here is praise is awaiting you, Elohim Beyatzon, God in so something like praise is awaiting you in Zion, God, and to you. No, I'm sorry. Praise is awaiting you, God, and vows will be performed to you in Zion, something like that. So I want to double check here that we've got the right psalm. Yeah. Okay. We begin. Verse 9. Verse 9, we'll scroll down here. Pakada haaretz vetasokekaha ufta. Rabat tesarena peleg Elohim male mayim takin daganam ki ken tikeneha. You visit the earth and the water. You enrich it greatly. The river of God is full of water. You provide their grain, for so you have prepared it. You provide their grain, for so you have prepared. I think this prepared it probably has got a better. Let's look this one up. Prepared it. Established, appointed, prepared is also in here. Make ready. I get the feeling that it makes it would make more sense. Like you provide their grain, like something like the idea of appointed. In other words, that the river is full, like the Egyptians base their whole life around the cycle of the Nile, right? The Nile floods in the spring, and when it does, that's when they plant. As the Nile recedes, the crops grow. The sun in that area, the wetness of the soil of the flooding, and then the sun make it an ideal place to grow. Right, crops, grain grows, and then slowly over time the soil dries out over the summer and or the hot period, dry period, and then you harvest, and then every year you start again. This like cyclical idea, right? The second part, the river of God is full of water. Um, that's the thing with living next to a river. I have to imagine it's somewhat stressful if it's a important part to your property, like it increases the value. Or if you just enjoy the river, you're fishing the river, it's maybe your livelihood, or maybe you have a mill on the river. I imagine, when you go to Sioux Falls here, the downtown, main area falls, there was a lumber mill there. There was a what do you call it? Like a I don't think they called it a loom. I think they called it. They were making fabric there. So they had a factory that was doing that. They had a factory that was milling grain, um, and a couple other things. Power plant at one time. But I have to imagine there were years or summers where the river was low, and when the river's low enough, it won't drive those implements. So in other words, the point being here is when you're on a river, it is kind of a situation where you're very much at the mercy of when the rains fall, if the rains fall, and by extension, if you're at the mercy of the rains, you're at the mercy of God. If He'll make the river full or not. Well, this is the difference between a river in earth or in life that is, flawed by sin like everything else, and then God's river. I can't help but think about Revelation, right? Two spots. Number one, Revelation talks about a river flowing out of Zion when it comes down. Let's see here. Yeah. So Revelation 22. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. So it flows out from God. And then you think about Genesis, the Garden of Eden is the source of the rivers that go out into the world. It's like this perfect place where water comes from it, and then God's throne in Revelation is a similar thing. It's this perfect place where water flows from it. And then you have to think about too. There's places where Moses strikes the rock, and in God's power, water comes from it, and it flows out. And those places become a spring of living water. Of living water because they just continue to produce water. And then we have, the water flowing out of the riven side of Christ, right? He is struck, and in it, the liquid, let's say that, comes out of his side separated into two parts, right? So you have blood and then you have water. So which happens in a body that the water separates from the rest of the plasma, so to speak. So, water comes out of Christ. We have this idea of the river of water coming out of Revelation. And then Psalm 46, right? There's a river whose city makes glad, there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God. So we have that as well. So this is a pretty regular image. The idea being here is that the river of God is always full. It always flows. There's never any. So in Revelation, in the new heavens and new earth, it is a place where we're free from sin, and by extension, we're free from anxiety, free from fear, free from want, from need. Will there be enough grain to support us through the year? Will there be enough food to make it through the winter? It's not a concern anymore because God is supplying us directly, and in a very different, direct way, right? You visit the earth. Let's see what the ESV has to say here. So, verse 5. No, I'm sorry, not verse 5. Verse 9. You visit the earth and water. Yeah, so visit, pakada, comes from pakad, to attend to visit, to muster, to appoint. That makes sense. So the Lord comes down, he dwells with his people, he visits them, right? So he visits the earth and the water. Of course, the Lord is the master of water and of land because he made them both. And Jesus does this where he takes fruits of the earth, bread and fish. Well, actually, that's an interesting little thing here. He takes fruits of the earth and fruits of the sea. Fruits of the earth in terms of loaves of barley, and fruits of the sea, say, with the 2 fish. And he multiplies them greatly. So he can do whatever he wishes with both earth and water. And then you enrich it greatly. That's interesting. Let's see here. Yeah, so there's no note here for. I'm curious, kind of, why there's nothing here for. Maybe there's something in my NIV. Let's check that out. I really got to get a better set of bookshelves. Okay. So, Psalm 65. Excuse me. Um, hmm. Yeah, it doesn't talk about the idea of enriching it. Well, let's look it up. Let's maybe try to get a sense of it from the word itself. To be or to become rich, enrich, properly to accumulate, to grow, wax. That's interesting. Make rich. Okay. Maybe an interesting thing we could talk about here is just this idea of chiefly to grow. So this idea of growing and then becoming rich, or the proceeds growing. If that is definitely something that Christ does, right? When he literally, when he's treading on the water and he walks to the boat and then stills the storm and the sea and the waves and the storm. Excuse me, I'll get it right one of these times. It definitely enriches or grows faith in the disciples. And you could definitely, if you're so there are other places we could talk about the Lord visiting the earth. The Lord walking with Adam and Eve in the garden, the visitor to Abraham, wrestling with Jacob. There's lots of places. We could point at some of them and say, this is God enriching the earth. But maybe if we were to interpret in the terms of Christ specifically, we can see that what Christ does is he grows faith in many and numerous ways, through miracles, through preaching and teaching, through parables, right? I think saying you visit the earth and the water is a simple way to say everything. So all of earth is separated up into either eretz, land, or water. And God, when he visits, greatly enriches it. His footsteps, his presence, right? We could easily say that his presence enriches our lives in many and numerous ways. Then maybe how we would understand this for you have appointed it or prepared it would just be, the harvest happens when God appoints it to happen. He means for it to happen. And in this scenario where God is enriching the world because he's treading upon it, that activity is good, right? The grain is reaped at the proper time under God's benevolent control and care. We don't need to worry about it. We don't need to, a big problem in where I lived previously was at the end of the year, at the end of the growing season, when the sugar beets started kind of finishing and the wheat and the corn. It's also a time of year where in the fall, rains would fall and the soil was very sticky. It was very good soil, but very they used to call it gumbo. It was very thick and kind of a lot of clay in it, a lot of silt. So it just would stick to everything. So it would rain. It would then get very difficult to get in and out of the fields. And also the last thing you want, like if you were to cut the grain and lay it down before you prepare to harvest it, the last thing you want is as the grain is laying on the ground for it to get rained on. Same thing with hay. When corn gets rained on, you can't harvest right away because you want it to be a certain amount dry. Otherwise, you've got to dry it, and that's very expensive. So it was very inopportune most years. I remember we had one year where the snow came off really early, and it was fairly dry in the spring. So the farmers got in early. For Breckenridge, it was early. It was I think they got in early May. They got in. Maybe it was even, I think it was late April that year. We had a really light snowpack, and then they got in late April because everything was off the fields. Then we got some really opportune rain throughout May and a little bit into June. Not a lot, but just enough to really make things grow. And then it was good and hot weather for the rest of the summer until September. And then we had a mild fall too. So they got in all the crops. I remember it being strange because a lot of the farmers were in church more often than usual because they got all the crops off really easily and fast. They didn't make up excuses about needing to be out the farm. It was a crazy year, but it was because the ability that the water came at the right time, the grain came off at the right time, everything was dry at the right time, and the Lord has appointed it so. So the best year that we've ever had, that is going to be just an inkling of what life will be like in the new heavens, new earth, which I think verse 9 is getting at. Verse 10. Tela meha rabeh nahet gedu deha bir bibim temogegena. Wow, these are weird words today. Temogegena simha tabarek. Barak is to bless, so it's a derivation. It's a prefix added to Barak, which to bless. Okay. Okay. So these words that are coming up in verse 10, that have much to do with farming. When you go out into, it's actually an interesting story. I remember I read a historical marker. I always stop and read historical markers when I can. There was a historical marker in Breckenridge talking about the name and why there are several Breckenridges. And the reason is that when you would open up that sod for the first time, they have a single ferrule plow or maybe a couple, and they would open up that sod and they'd roll it over. You'd have these, as it says here, furrows or rows, ridges, and so that big thick layer of sod was called bracken, and then it was up in ridges, so they call it Brackenridge, right? And then it comes Breckenridge over time, and that's why you have several, because they were labeling it because of the farming practices of the day. Pretty common thing to have multiple names after the same name. We have Springfields, we have Breckenridges. There's other cities that are common names. Here it's talking about that like when you open a new field, because there's a sense of that when you have the cover, that does keep the moisture in the soil. So when you open it up, it's a process of drying out the soil. It is a little risky, right? You dry out that soil, you got to wonder if you open it up if it's going to water, so that what you're planting or how you're opening up the soil is going to be beneficial, right? So I think what it's getting at here is when we go out the process of opening soil, we go out the process of preparing to plant and to do the thing that is farming or grow, that the Lord's going to bless that, right? So it's ridges you water abundantly, it's furrows you settle with showers. And settle would be like the overturned soil becomes softened and kind of like we'll just kind of eventually flatten out because the water's hit it enough, and they break down and they kind of flatten, right? And then the next one is you make it soft, the soil, right? You bless its growth. Again, the soil. The strange thing is, as far as I can tell, all we ever have is furrows. We never actually have the word for soil. So, like, to make soft, it's furrowed, it's ridges, it grows stuff, but the verse never actually says the word for soil, which would probably be like ha'adamah. Adam is usually the word for, like, eretz is the word for land, kind of land mass, but Adam is usually the word that's used for soil, like literally which makes a lot of sense because Adam was formed out of the dust of the earth, right? So it's strange that it would refer to soil but never actually say the word soil, right? And maybe it's not that, now that I think about it, maybe it's not that unusual because to a certain extent, we talk about in Jesus when he tells the parables, he talks a lot about good soil. There's the parable of the rocky soil, the seed that falls on the path, the seed that falls amongst soil that has weeds in it, and then the seed that falls in a good soil, right? And what does God do to or for, or even we could say, because the last part of the sentence, you bless its growth, maybe even to make good soil, he showers down upon it blessings. He showers down upon it waters. When you live in the desert, water is a big deal, right? So, going on, itar ta, verse 11, sanat, tobateka, umagaleka, yirapun, dasen. So, itar ta, you crown the year with your goodness. That seems odd. Verse 11, you crown the year. Oh, no, you see about it. Your wagon tracks overflow with abundance. I wonder if this has, well, let's look at, that's probably going to help. Probably the notes will help more. No, it doesn't say it. Okay, so there is this concept called the year of Jubilee. I'm going to read you a little bit about it. So, every 50th year, come on. Oh my gosh. Okay, here we go. It's better. So the sabbatical year, after 7 cycles of 7 years, 49 years, the 50th year was to be a time of celebration, rejoicing for the Israelites. The year of Jubilee involved the release from indebtedness. All prisoners and captives were set free, all slaves were released, all debts were forgiven, and all property was returned to its original owners. In addition, all labor was to cease for 1 year, and those bound by labor contracts were released from them. One of the benefits of the Jubilee was that both the land and the people were able to rest. The Jubilee presents a beautiful picture of the New Testament themes of redemption and forgiveness. Well, we'll stop there. And then, yeah. There's also the Jubilee is the seventh year. 7 times 7 is 49, so 50th would be the year of Jubilee, right? Yeah. Okay. Also in Hebrew, the Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. But the law also spoke of a sabbatical year. So that would go like this. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself. You shall not reap what grows of itself in the harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide. I'm not quite understanding here. This doesn't seem to make sense. So, verse 5, you shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you. So, this doesn't seem to make sense if you're saying not to reap it, but then verse 6 says it'll provide food for you. My understanding was that in the Sabbath year, the 7th year, every 7th year, the land would be laid fallow. I was actually told by one of my farmers in my previous congregation that farmers still used to do that up until, the 1950s, 1960s. They would take their individual fields. So they wouldn't let all their farmland lay fallow, but they would take all of their fields and separate them up. And I think one of them, or maybe they have a schedule where several of them, every 7th year would get a rest. So they were still doing that practice. They thought, biblically, that there was some sign, there was spiritual belief, there was biblical truth, but also I think scientifically they thought there must be something there to it. Like this if God says that we should do it, maybe we should just keep doing it. So from what I got from my farmer friend, that everyone did it, even if some people weren't believers, strong believers or not, people just did this. But nobody does it anymore. Usually the reason is you just can't afford to let fields lay fallow. So anyway, the way he explained it, his name was Milan Drulo, really wonderful guy, good friend of mine. You would leave maybe you'd have like 5 different areas of your farm land, and maybe probably one out of the 5, you would be laying fallows, but there'd be on a rotation, right? So you wouldn't necessarily have it like on a set year for you. It would be more along the lines of each field has a 7-year rotation. So one of them is going to be laying fallow every year, right? And I would imagine that part of laying fallow too, because not a lot of farmers in that area were growing like grapes or food crops. I mean, you were growing corn and wheat, but mostly for cattle consumption, not necessarily for human consumption. So I'm guessing the reason I bring it up is I'm guessing that if they left, he said they would like plant sweetgrass or something like that, which is which kind of put nutrients back in the soil. But I would imagine too that they were letting animals eat it. Like they were pasturing it as well. I would imagine back when folks still had animals and land, like when they're farming crops and they had animals at the same time. Like that was pretty common. Nowadays, it's not that common anymore. So you'd think with like animals pasturing their especially cattle, they're leaving their feces behind, which is good nitrogen. It's good for the soil. All this. So it was a good thing for the soil. They don't do that anymore, but they used to. So I wonder if that's something to do with it here. With this idea of you crown the year with goodness. Could be referring to like a Sabbath year or the Sabbath year, the 7 times 7, or just the regular Sabbath year. It's a place, it's a time when nothing is planted, which farmers will tell you this too. Like if you left a field fallow and it was corn the year prior, the amount of corn that probably you spilled, corn's going to come up again still. Or for that matter, wheat or things like that. So this is kind of what's going on here is that they're reaping what was maybe left over from the last year. They're reaping grapes. They don't do anything to the grapes. They just pick whatever's there that grows by itself, right? And basically you don't put pressure on the land to produce. You let the land just do what it's going to do, and you trust in the Lord. And it's kind of a cool idea. Can you imagine so what 90% of the people working probably were farmers? I mean, a good portion of people are farming, probably the lion's share. So at least over 50% at least, I have to think, in this time period. And they're all just going to take a year of Jubilee. Can you imagine what that would be like? And I mean that in a very positive sense, right? Like it's just a year where you get to visit every person you've been wanting to visit for a long time. You get to spend time with your kids in a way that you just can't even imagine. You get to my friend Tim and I from the church who were talking about this the other day is that it's too bad you can't put your working years later in life and have your retirement years when you're younger so you can actually spend time with your kids. Because you're working all the time to support them. And this is how the world works. It's just we wish it's coming from a place of we're concerned as fathers that we're missing things in our children's growing up. When I grew up, my dad was a farmer, so he was, 100 feet from the house. Whenever I wanted to see him, my mom would take me down and we'd see him, right? He came in and ate lunch with us every day. So it was a different kind of working. It was a different kind of, like when he would go out to spread manure or when he would go out to bale, sometimes I would ride with him, right? So it's not the same now when my children go to school and I'm at work. We don't see each other until I pick them up from school at the end of the day. It's a different thing entirely. So what would a year of Jubilee be like? Can you imagine? Where the entire society, the entire culture is off for a year. We're just gonna and the idea also, this is a very special year. It's a celebratory thing. We're gonna revel in the glory that is God for a year. sounds kind of interesting. And so I wonder if this idea of your paths drip with abundance, it goes back, I think, to like verse 9, where it's talking about the Lord visiting the earth. And as he kind of comes or he's present, it enriches it greatly. I think this is kind of getting at that as well. The places where you go are enriched. They drip with abundance. I also wonder too if it has a little bit to do. It would be an interesting thing to see in a year of Jubilee where you don't plant anything, you don't do any work, and the land still produces. That would be weird to see, I think. Right? You put no work in, and yet the land still gives forth its good stuff. I could see how it would seem. I can see how you would write. Right? Your paths drip with abundance. Like everywhere you kind of are, wherever your presence is, like all of a sudden the world, the earth, just kind of bursts forth into abundant life and growth. That's pretty neat. So verse 12. Yirapu Neot Midbar Vigil Gabot Tagorena. Okay, well, so I think we finally get to the thing here in verse 13 where we have flocks, Hatson with flocks. So starting back with verse 12, you're a poo drip. Yeah, that makes sense. Drip down. So literally, like the pastures of the midbar, they drip in it. This would be in kind of like a sense of they drip with abundance, with life, right? So this is part of like Isaiah, the 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 wilderness springs forth into life. This is who else talks about this? I think Joel talks about this. I think Amos talks about this, that the desert places become alive in the day that the Lord comes, right? So the pastures of the wilderness, they kind of drip with life. The hills rejoice on every side. So then verse 13, Lebasu Karim Hasson, the pastures are clothed with flocks. So there's so many sheep out there that it becomes almost like a sweater for the hills, for the mountains. They're so abundant, right? I have to imagine that a shepherd's life. I've been to Israel and I've seen it. I've never seen it in the rainy time, so I don't know exactly what that's like. But I was there in December, January, during the kind of colder, drier months, and it is a desert, man. It is crazy how you go into certain areas and think to yourself, like, how is a shepherd finding anything for the sheep to eat in these places? But like I found out in Arizona when I was there, another desert climate, right? You get there in September, it's hot, and then all of a sudden you're there through like late November, starting in December, and it's cool. It's brilliant every day. It's cool in the morning, cool at night, 7 degrees during the day. It's beautiful, and like it's a little bit wet. You get a little rain, and then it's just crazy. Just everything, this desert just starts getting green. There are flowers everywhere. There's just stuff all over the place, right? I would imagine, I don't know what it's exactly like, but I would imagine it's a big concern when you're a shepherd in a desert locale, finding places to pasture sheep. And what it seems like verse 12 is trying to say is that because of God, right, the wilderness is dripping with pasture land where there are sheep all over the place. Almost inconceivable, right? So, and the valleys, Vemakim, Yaapu, Bar, Yetowau, Ap, Yasiru. And the valleys are covered with grain. Well, that'll make more sense. So the valleys like the lower areas, right? So the hills, fairly common, I think, to pasture in the hills, because what happens is I think you'd pasture in the low areas during the cool parts, right? And then when it gets hot, what do? Well, you go up higher because the snow is melting or whatever, and you've got water. It's cooler up in the mountains. So in the hot times, you'd move them up further to find cooler areas where there is still pasture land. So this makes sense. Like these mountains or these high places or just the hills, right? They're covered with green grass, and the sheep are so many that they just clothe the whole mountainside. And down in the valley where it's more flat and there's more arable land, well they're covered with grain, right? They shout for joy, they sing also. So if you go back to, if we go this, you crown the year with your goodness. So it's like a year of jubilee, and there's ample pasture ground up in the mountains for sheep, and on the lower valleys there's grain aplenty, and there's so many, the wine, the grapevines are still producing in a, I mean, like, so they're on a year of jubilee, and yet the land is still, flowing of milk and honey. It's producing bountifully. What is the end result? They shout for joy, also they sing. They shout and sing together for joy. And this could be referring to the people observing what's going on, or it could literally be referring to, a lot of times in these Psalms, they personify physical things. Like in Psalm 46, for example, it talks about the rivers clapping their hands, and the mountains trembling and throwing themselves into the heart of the sea. So maybe this is actually talking about not the people, but literally the valleys, the hills, the sheep, the furrows. They're all seeing this wonderful bounty of God, and they're shouting for joy and singing, praising Him. Right? You can go either way. I think either one is equally valuable, and they're both good. So that's Psalm 65. Definitely a really cool psalm of praise to God. For this one would definitely there's hardly any mention at all, if you've noticed. Let's see here. I mean, verse 5 refers to it a little bit. The awesome deeds. But for the most part, it seems like this is a psalm that is praising God for His work in creation, not necessarily His work in history for Israel. Just He makes His promised land flow with milk and honey. Yeah. So, Psalm 65. Had fun? We'll talk to you guys next week when we get into Psalm 66. Lord's blessings on your weekend.